Welcome to the tutorial for collisions and physical materials. This will be one of the longest tutorials yet for MoveIt because it covers a lot of topics. I will have timestamps available in the comments so you can skip to whatever section you want to learn about, but if you really just want to understand MoveIt and what it can do, probably best to watch the whole thing. So first, we'll go through an overview of what's covered so you can know what to expect. We'll start by going through the physical material, and I'll cover each setting and how it works and how to use it. We'll go through collision profile setup. You don't necessarily need to change anything there, but you can still fix a lot of problems that you may encounter if you understand this, and you can also just change the behavior. We will go through the core systems. The core systems are the footsteps, or otherwise referred to as bone impacts, because it's not restricted to feet. There's hitting walls, scuffing walls, hitting other characters, and finally we'll go through how to set up different assets, such as different particles or sounds, on a per character basis at the end. Alright, so let's get started. The first thing that we need to get out of the way is if we have a landscape. This is not a landscape, but if it's a landscape, there will be an option for generate overlap events if your footsteps are not playing. You can see the default footstep is quite subtle, but it is playing. For whatever reason, the meshes, they don't need it, but landscapes do, so you would enable this. It does come with a performance cost, which is why landscapes probably have it disabled by default. So the main thing is, if you want footsteps on your landscape, enable it. Okay, with that out of the way, let's come to the MoveIt content, FX, impacts, PM, MI default. If you make a character based on BP MoveIt character or the example character, you will see that it has a default physical material assigned, which is PM, MI default. And this is the material it uses if there is no MoveIt physical material applied to a surface. So there's two ways to apply a physical material. The first is through a material itself. So if I just make let's make a test material. We'll use a proper prefix, test material. Open it up, and you'll see there is a box for physical materials, and I can do PM MI default. So we can just say this material is used as a default, which is a little pointless because our character does that for us. So this material, all I'm going to do is I'm just going to plug in a generic color, but not quite the generic color that it uses, like just a subtle hint of something else in there. So you can tell it's not exactly the same. Okay. Oh, and we'll have it be fully rough. So if I take the default material, that would mean that I have the basic defaults assigned that MoveIt offers. They're not good, they're not definitely not great, but it gives you something to work with. So for the sake of learning, we will make our own. So we just come, where is it? Under physics, physical material, and then we select MI physical material. And I'm just going to go PM, MI test 01. I'm going to duplicate it, and we're going to have a test 2 just for later. So we're going to go through all these settings. So starting with lookup, the default setting is this material. It means that where it gets the assets from is this material. It can also get it from functions in my character that we will cover at the end of the tutorial because it's how you handle per character assets. For now, we just leave it as default. So we have a hit sound. This is a sound that's played when you hit a wall at speed. Scuff sound is just when you walk next to a wall and you're kind of brushing against it. Bone impact sound or footstep, well, needs no explanation. So if we have a look at these curves, you see there's a velocity to volume and velocity to pitch for the hit, scuff, and bone impact. So if we look at the hit one, because everything else is just flat, it's just basically one volume, one pitch, no modification based on velocity. So if we are moving at a speed of 300 or less, it will just have a volume of 1, no change. But if we get to 700 or higher, it will be at 1.5, and of course everything within that range. So you can make it so that the faster you're moving, the louder it is, or the pitch can be lower or higher, however, whatever sounds better to you and for your game. So the particle system type, by default it's set to Niagara, because Niagara is the modern particle system. So Legacy just, well, it uses the old system. Nothing special going on there. You just use whatever setting is correct for whatever particles you have. So all this other stuff is just a default physical material properties. You have surface types and so forth. So I won't cover that because you will find tutorials on it elsewhere, and this is specific to MoveIt. So make sure you're going to delete these after all. And we're going to take the default one here. So we go content, copy here. Let's change it to my test 01, and then we have 2. So if I open this up, you'll see that some of these curves do actually have settings. This one's grayed out because if I expand it, it has a default impact velocity volume. It just makes it easy that you have a curve that you can just slap on all these assets without having to set the keys for each one individually if you have multiple physical materials, which usually a full game will have multiple. So, yeah. So we've covered the physical material and how it works. The next, I guess, chapter will be on setting up ducking and not setting up ducking, but the collision profile for ducking. So if I just character is usable, faithful, okay. And what animation is he using? This one. Okay, so I open up the animation blueprint and we come to the ducking node, or the duck node, ducks under obstacles. So there is a duck trace channel which is set to world static by default. In the past, the default was visibility, so if you haven't updated, it might still be visibility. This can cause issues where it might collide with something you don't want it to. Because MoveIt is a plugin and collisions are in a project, it can't give you custom channels. So if we only want to be able to duck between certain objects, we need to have a channel for those objects. So we can say new object channel, and by default, because it's world static, we'll set it to world static duck. So we just have a duck channel for world static object duck. Now if we come to the presets, you have to open it, then collapse it, then open it to get a scroll bar sometimes. Except in this case, I think we're actually seeing them all. Yeah, okay. Now, if we take a block all dynamic, this tends to be, block all seems to be what the world static uses, and it just blocks everything. So we could make a preset for objects that you duck under, and we'd assign it world static duck, and it would have these settings. It would also have maybe just collision enabled. I'm not going to do it because how you set up your collisions is up to you. Main thing I want to point out is that if you have issues where it's trying to duck under something, you can't figure out why, or your character just constantly ducks, maybe he's holding an object that actually detects this channel, and so it keeps trying to duck under what he's holding. This is where you go. This is how you prevent that issue. And yeah, that's the gist of it. Nothing's going to be set towards that it ducks. So if I change the channel here, it's not, he's just going to stop ducking. But say I had an alley and there's overhanging lamps that I know he's going to need to duck under. If I want to control what he can actually duck under, I can do it this way. So the next collision profile setup is for Ragdoll. If I just go to and place client, new editor window, and I just stick him in Ragdoll, come to the other one and I can walk into them. So what if I don't want to be able to walk into them? Then I'm probably going to need to come to the mesh, and we come to the collision. So got a custom preset. It is a physics body. By default, it is a physics body. And it ignores the pawn, but it doesn't ignore a physics body, which means one physics body, being a character, will collide with another physics body, being a character. Oh, sorry, a character mesh, a character. So if you want to change that, you could make your own object type that is just called character mesh, and then you'll have control over what the Ragdoll does and does not interact with. It's pretty straightforward, but I thought it was worth covering. So the other thing is back to the animation blueprint. The foot IK also has trace channel. Where did it go? Oh, okay, right onto the IK foot trace channel visibility. So it's just going to stand on anything using IK if it conflicts with the visibility channel. If you're holding a weapon and your weapon conflicts with the visibility channel, well, I mean, you can just look where the axe is. I mean, yeah, sure, he's in a stupid pose. It's very unlikely, but his foot could overlap it and he could try and stand on it. Maybe that would look cool. Probably not quite what you want, so it might be worth setting up a channel for the foot IK to collide with, because by default he'll use IK on another character, on dynamic objects. It's up to you. You could leave it how it is until you run into an issue, but if you do, you know how to fix it. So we've got all the easy stuff out of the way, and we're going to go into the core system in detail. Let's start with footsteps, since we have the animation blueprint right here. If you come into class defaults, and we can just start collapsing stuff to in place, strafe, okay. And we have impacts. Yeah, it's a little ambiguous. Surface impacts, sure, a little ambiguous. But the reason it's ambiguous is, sure, we have the foot and the footstep L socket, so it's clearly a footstep system, but I come down here and suddenly we have the hands as well. The reason we have the hands included is this Ragdoll only attribute. The hands only have these footsteps, which is why it's called a surface impact instead, enabled if you are in Ragdoll. Same with the head. So the head and hands, when they interact with the ground, they can cause the same surface impact, which is one of the good things about this system, actually. So, of course, the 2 feet are not Ragdoll only, but everything else is. So the bone is pretty self-explanatory. It even tells you the bone that is used to compute velocity. So how fast the foot moves impacts the result that you get. So the minimum velocity to actually cause it to trigger, the min start height, the trace distance from the ground. If you're having issues with them actually triggering, or them triggering too often, these are the attributes that you want to actually look at. You can use draw debug trace If I compile, we'll see the trace for the left foot. Change this back. So you can see what it's doing. And it's good to be able to visualize this. You see every time the foot lands, there is a hit. You also notice there, the foot kind of basically, when you came to a stop, it's basically slid across the ground, triggering it multiple times, which is why we have the min trigger interval. It can only have a footstep every 0.2 seconds. There is a log threshold, because if you think about it, say you're making a 64-player Battlefield 5 game, and you've got all these people running around in the distance. You don't want them triggering footsteps. It also means your mesh must be set up to actually have logs. And it must have a level 2 log for this to work. So when it's a certain distance away, the footsteps will no longer play. And that is huge for optimization, where it concerns triggering massive amounts of particles. Enabled is pretty self-explanatory. It's just so if you want to, you can change this during runtime. So this footstep is now disabled if you need to do so. Okay, that covers the footstep system where the animation setup is concerned. But of course we have a physical material. The bone impact sound is the footstep sound. You can change the volume based on how hard the foot hits the ground. And you can change the pitch with the same thing. And you have the bone impact particle, which is just basic footstep by default. So this is where you change which assets are used, and the velocity to the volume and the velocity to the pitch. So between the physical material and the animation setup, that is basically the entire footstep or bone impact setup. The only other thing is if it's per character. In the per character tutorial will also be relevant if you want to change these assets at runtime based on other parameters. So it's not just per character, it's kind of per scenario as well. It's up to you really, but there is a cost if you don't just do it from this material. Like I said, it's most performant. I don't really have a good understanding of what that cost is, but I know it will not be entirely free. Okay, so we've got a test material. I'm going to make an instance. My test 01, duplicate 02. So if I come into 01, I can assign the physical material 01. Same with 02, assign 02. You can, like I said, you can also assign it to a mesh itself. So we have a physical material somewhere. Yeah, phys material override, you can assign it there. But for now, I'm going to put test 1 on here, test 2 on here. So I'm going to take test 1. I'm going to change it to say Niagara. The impact particle, this one can be the grass particle. I've imported the surface footstep pack from free assets, so you can grab that too if you like. And on the second one, come down, we'll also go to Niagara, and this can just be something very different. Heavy snow. Let's save everything. I'm going to replay. So we have the default one just on the surface, which is had nothing assigned. I jump up on here, and it's playing the leaf particle. Back to default, jump up on here, and we have the snow. So one thing to keep in mind where velocity is concerned, yeah, you have normal walking around, and when you sprint, sure, you have more velocity. But the other thing is, if you jump off something high and hit the ground, using that volume means that you can hit the ground with a higher volume. I mean, you could also drive your particle with it and have a bigger effect without having to make multiple effects. It's up to you how you set this up because it's very game dependent. So we're on to hit wall now. So I just scroll down, physical impact, there we are. So this is where, well, you can enable and disable it so it either ever occurs or doesn't, and you can change it at runtime too. So there's really no walls in this level, so I'm just going to dump a cube in here. Just get rid of that warning by making it stationary. So if I play. Now if I run into this wall, you'll see that there was a particle effect that played. If I do it slowly, it still plays. And he also physically reacts as well, so his body kind of reacts to that impact. So if I come back here and then I sprint, the physical reaction is a bit bigger. Now, come back to MoveIt. Okay. So can hit wall while playing, while montage playing. Can hit wall while root motion montage playing. I think they're quite self-explanatory in what they do, but when you use them is what's important. Okay, let's say you make a root motion climbing system, which is not a good idea in multiplayer, but it's an example. You probably don't want these effects triggering. And if all you're using the root motion for is that, it's very easy to just disable it here and be done with it. And what if you have an attack system that plays using montages? Again, you probably don't want him having that physical reaction from hitting the wall when you're just trying to play an attack animation, because it will kind of make it look like it spazzes out a bit. The minimum interval is 0.1, so you can only have this effect every 0.1 seconds. There's a LOD threshold. Again, performance optimization. You don't want heaps of characters spawning particles when you're not even near them. Impact velocity threshold. You have to be moving this fast when occur. So that physics impulse. If we have an impact velocity of 9,000, now impact velocity is a little different to say, oh, it's a bit difficult to explain, but how hard you hit something is calculated by a slightly different system. So it's best to just play around with values and then go walk into some walls and see what works for you. Let's see if I collapse those. Okay. So you can, of course, use an external curve, but we don't care about that right now. So bone name is just the bone that, like it says, it applies the impulse to this bone. So blend in time and blend out just gives it an ease in and ease out. Well, you know, it blends it in and out with that physics impact. And we have the min blend weight, max blend weight. You can play with these and you can just basically observe the effect as you run into walls. That is essentially how you set it up. The blend option just changes how it blends in and out. It's the same as any animation system, basically, only it's physically impacted. So the other thing for hitting a wall is, once again, the physical material. And it's all the same as a footstep impact system. There's nothing else going on. The scuff will be the exact same. I won't even bother to open the physical material. I don't feel like I need to change much to show you what it does, because they all revolve around the same systems. So scuffing the wall. I mean, it's effectively like hit wall, only it's when you walk alongside it. See those particles that pop up as you walk alongside it? Yeah, it's not a continual thing. And how continual it can be really depends on your angle to the wall. The default settings are basically set up so that it doesn't trigger easily. And again, it's got an interval, it's got a threshold. It's got an interval for the particle as well. So if I set this to 0.2, then even when I'm on that angle, it's not going to keep triggering all the time. It's just very intermittent. But the way the particle's set up, it's made to trigger quite a lot. The other thing is characters. Going to go back to the player's client, to characters. Just get out of here and come to this one. So if I run into this guy, he makes a sound. And he reacts to being run into. And likewise. So we have similar options to hitting the wall, which has already been covered. So we'll probably just pass over them. So the defaults might be different, but also the settings are more or less the same, while the properties are the same. So you get hit character impact physics, which is when your character, so if I'm this guy here, this is hit character. I run into him, he is hit by character. I mean, when you got hit by a character, it does this. When you hit a character, it does this. There's a very low impulse, and it caps out quite low. And when you're hit by a character, there's a huge impulse, which is why you see very little reaction from the character who is doing the hitting and a big reaction from the character who is getting hit. Okay. So velocity threshold must be moving this fast to hit a character, must be moving this fast to experience being hit by a character, except it applies to the velocity of the character it's running into you. Otherwise, when you're standing still, it would just never trigger. You have a grunting sound for if you hit a character and one for if you're hit by a character. And there's also a voice. The meaning behind having a grunting sound and a voice, well, there's a min voice interval and it's set to 5, whereas these intervals are 0.5. So it can play a grunt every time you get hit, but a grunt is a very quick sound. Whereas this voice could be like, oi, stop that, or hey, watch where you're going. And you wouldn't want that to play often. And by using a sound cue, you can randomize the voice line. Okay, so that about covers it for the character. So one thing that all of the hit events have in common is that they have events. So we have on hit character, scuff wall, and of course hit wall. If I do an assign, you'll see the type of information that you get. Now the reason there's no hit by character is because you have the other character. You can just make an event on that character, cast to your character blueprint, and tell them you got hit, and pass whatever information you feel is relevant. These are all an MI character, so you can extend the system any way you want through these delegates. The other thing, and I think I forgot to mention we're covering this, is when you take a shot. So in the feature demo, in the MoveIt content example, sorry, not feature demo, example map. I'm not going to bother saving it. There is a turret. You see this? This is what the turret's looking for. Let's just go standalone player, select a viewport. I'm going to go into that area. Starts shooting me. It's actually missing when I'm just standing because it's not set up particularly well, to be blunt. Now you can see his hands twitching, the crouch, his legs twitching. We go here, his body's twitching. I'll be the first to admit the way it's set up is pretty quick and dirty. Now maybe if I just change to Wraith, So he's got the same thing. It's set up using the default values after all. So I haven't had to do anything yet. So we're going to go to take shot. We've got shot, impact, physics. Okay, so this area, you don't need to supply a bone name because this is provided by the hit or the trace, basically. You just leave it as none. It's only here because it's using the same struct as everything else. And the settings, because it uses the same struct, are again the same. But then we have this, and this is what's important. Shot, impact, bone, redirect. If it hits a pelvis, it's going to like rotate the entire character. So instead, we transfer the hit from the pelvis to spine 1. If it hits a hand, we transfer it to the lower arm. Let me just see if I can get it to actually hit the hand. Okay, now it's hitting the hand, but you see instead of just the hand moving, which would be really subtle, we've got the whole lower arm responding to the hand being hit. Because if you get shot in the hand, your hand isn't just going to do a little twitch. You'll be like, ow, and your whole arm will move. We could even transfer it to the upper arm if we wanted to. And the foot, for the same reason, goes to the calf. It's just a better effect. So if you have bones that when hit don't give you the effect you want, you just redirect them to a bone that will. So I'm going to open up the turret blueprint, which is really just a rifle. And what's important in here is a function on MI character called take shot physics impact. And this is where it gets a bone name. That's why you don't have to set one. All of this you just set based on the hit result. If you don't have a hit result, you compute it however works for your game. You could get the hit component, convert it to a skeletal mesh, and provide that instead if you want to. And I think that covers it for taking the shot. Now then, the final thing to go over is per character assets. So if you want to change the asset that is used based on runtime logic or for different characters, this is where you do it. The most common scenario would be the footsteps. So notice the square brackets, most performant, if you just take it from the material that is most performant. If you take it from code, that's fine too, for the most part. Take it from blueprint, there's going to be a high cost just because every single footstep for every single character is going to be calling a blueprint function, which runs in a virtual machine, just isn't very performant. So there's two ways to do this. If you come into Visual Studio, this is the function here in MI character. Just open it properly. And yeah, it says not recommended, called frequently and not performant. So there's also get bone impact Niagara. This is the blueprint one, this is the code one. This is a virtual function. If you make a character, it tells you what to do. You can just copy and paste this into your own character, but the main thing you want to notice is final. So override final means that I'm not going to be overridden in any derived class. There's no need to keep looking for further instances of me. And that means it's more performant. So with a system that is so heavily used, this could mean something. It says mark the override as final for performance gains. So you should definitely do that. So if you want to do it per character, please use C++. If you absolutely can't or won't, or maybe you're developing for iOS and it has to be blueprint only because you don't have a Mac, then okay, maybe you can take the performance hit if it's even that significant. It really hasn't been tested. So we'll just go through how to set it up. So to use this, the first thing is you need surface types because you need a way to identify this physical material. Now, you can identify it without surface types. I will show you that first. So we come into the character. You go override. You'll notice you can override the Niagara hit particle using the legacy system and the hit sound. Same for scuffing, same for bone impacts, but since we've got it set to Niagara, one of the limiting factors, and it's limiting because I don't want to convolute the system excessively, is that physical material, everything you use with it has to be either Niagara or either legacy particles. Now, this already lets us just say, okay, if it calls this function, we're always just going to return grass. So we'll have a look at that already. This is default because it doesn't have a material that is marked correctly. Whoops, I bumped the escape key. But we need to also, it wasn't working. I don't give you time to see that, and that's the main thing. We need to change it to blueprint in my character, the one you want to avoid. So we get the generic one, but when we're on here, now we get leaves because we're returning leaves. This one is set to snow. We will get snow because we haven't changed it to be from blueprint, which we will do now. Ideally, you'd be using code, but for the sake of tutorial, and now that I've explained that, we'll just use blueprint to move forward with the tutorial. Okay, so we can actually do an object lookup, which is a little unordinary. So we could do a select place based on this. If it's this material, we will return, let's say, ice. If it's not, we will return heavy snow. Big apply. Heavy snow, that's the wrong one. So we're returning heavy snow because it is this one. It's true. Oh no, we're returning ice, aren't we? I should not have chosen similar ones. Let's just change that really quickly to something water, heavy, and grass. So we get heavy water if we're using the first physical material. There we are, heavy water. And I'm going to change this one as well. Oh, I already did. Okay, so that is set up properly. So we should get grass on this one. And we do. And we should get heavy water on this one. And we do. And this is just from this function. So this is a really bad way of using it, but you can use it this way. Let's get rid of it though and do it the proper way. Sorry, not plugin. Edit, project settings, you just type surface, and it comes up with surface types. So we'll say we'll have leaves, snow, water. And then we can close it. Let's compile that. Then you go and get surface type. So select. And now we can choose, and this is it. This is basically it. We have our surface type. If this is a normal character, we can just turn on normal assets, but we could have massive versions for massive characters or different versions for different characters. The other thing to mention, override, get physical material override. Whatever you return from here is just a physical material that is then applied. So why would you use this? Simple. Let's say you have an ability such as an electric attack, but when you use that attack, your footsteps have electric particles. You'd return a physical material that has that. And that also means you could return a physical material that changes friction, but I wouldn't, because this doesn't run through the prediction system, so that could cause a bit of desync. Just to warn you, the main usage here is to change what asset is used. So when I was making this tutorial, I did realize one problem with it. Notice this setting called Fallback mode, and definitely read the tooltip to understand it. But let's say you have a character that just uses all the stuff all your characters do, and generally that's how you would handle that. But then you have this astronomical monster that needs different assets, so you change it to blueprint or code. But you still want your character to use this stuff. Now by default, this blueprint and code function returns a null pointer, which means your character needs to implement this and return all this stuff all over again. And that could get really tedious doing it for each character when you only needed it for one monster. So if you change it to this option or to code and you implement it for your monster, but you don't implement anything for your character, what was going to happen is this here. So if I look at the character, I'm just returning nothing. And that's the default attribute. So you see, there's no particle playing because we haven't told it what particle to play. But we can change the fallback mode to this material. So if it returns nothing, then it's just going to use what's in here. And you notice we get the particles again based on the material. Alright, so that covers everything for the footsteps, the overall impact system and how you use it. Thank you for watching.